Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and if I sound even more excited than usual today, it's because I am, because we've got an awesome business mind on today's episode. I am joined by Melissa Jacobs, who is the founder of Crow and Pitcher LLC. I'm so excited to hear the backstory behind the name Crow and Pitcher. It's something we're definitely going to talk about, but to tell you a little bit about Melissa, she has spent more than 20 years in marketing and innovation roles in a Fortune 500 consumer goods company. But after doing that, she decided to ditch the 9-to-5 altogether to work squarely in her zone of genius, which we're going to get in today because she is a growth strategist where she works with middle market business leaders to spark transformational growth with data-driven insights and focused strategies so they can, this is my favorite part and why I'm so excited to talk to Melissa today, so they can grow more by doing less. We're going to talk about her free ebook at the end of today's episode, but she's got so many awesome resources out there, and it's all going to start with you getting awesome value from her here today. So without any further ado, let's dive into my interview with Melissa Jacobs. All right, Melissa, welcome to the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here with you today.
Heck yeah. Honestly, so much that I want to dig into. Obviously, the thing that caught my eye, as soon as I saw this on your website, I was like, we have to have Melissa on the show. We're going to talk about growing more by doing less. But before we get there, I always love asking listeners to take us beyond just the bio. Tell us at a high level, who is Melissa?
Well, what a question. So I grew up and built my toolkit and all my experience over those 20 years in corporate America. I had innovation and product development roles, and then moved into marketing and strategy roles. And I got to work on some really well-known brands. My absolute favorite was leading strategy and innovation for Kleenex, which was such a great opportunity. But now today I get to be my own CEO and lead strategist at Crow and Pitcher, where I get to work with a variety of business leaders to accelerate their growth. And I just love helping them cut through the clutter and focus their limited resources on what matters most. And, you know, it's been great to be able to make that shift like so many people do, and really just focus in on what I love to do the most.
Yeah, I always love having guests on that came from those Fortune 500 backgrounds. I never worked in companies that were that big. I only worked in corporate really for 10 months, and it was at a 10,000 employee healthcare company. So I need to ask you, what are the differences? That's such a big shift from big business to running your own business. What are some of those differences that you've seen?
Well, there's certainly a huge difference in the number of people. Absolutely. One of the things about really big businesses is that there's so many people that you get to really focus and niche down. So unlike a lot of the middle market companies that I work with, where the business leaders are doing it all, they're responsible for the day-to-day and trying to find time for strategic thinking and bigger picture thinking. In those big companies, you've got people who are specialized and focused on just running the business, just focusing on, delivering this year's P&L. And then you have the luxury of also having people who get to focus on the 3 to 5 year business plan, get even closer to the consumer, and really, focus on what's next. And, I've been lucky to have both of those roles. Most people do. They get to work on both sides of the equation, but it's always amazing to me how in those roles you get to, when you get to focus on the long term, how your brain changes. And now for me working, in that zone all the time, I get to come in and pick the pieces I want to work on. I get to focus on those bigger picture thinking pieces, and I get to help people who are trying to do it all get a breather, get a moment to look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, I love that overview. I got to ask you straight up front, Melissa, because I've seen on your business website, I've seen obviously in your bio, you use the term middle market business leaders. I'd love for you to talk about that because clearly with your brain having had so much marketing and growth experience at all different levels, I'm curious the way that you see middle market as a term, and also what does that broader landscape look like?
Absolutely. So if you think about those Fortune 500 or even Fortune 1000 companies, those are really big enterprises where they have those really big teams and lots of specialists. On the complete other end of the spectrum, you've got small business and, those folks who are either going at it alone or they're, really just at the beginning or even wanting to stay in small business. Middle market is in the in-between. So it's, a 10 million business, even all the way up to a $1 billion business. The Fortune 1000, I think, is about $2 billion businesses today. So even getting below Fortune 1000 are still really big businesses. But it's a lot of those businesses in the middle where they're not those giant enterprises, but they're also not, just starting out or in the small business realm.
Yeah, it's fun to hear even at those levels because you're right, that does scale to a huge revenue number. It takes you all the way up still in the middle market. But the thing that I love as a lifelong solopreneur, I love running small businesses, is that middle market businesses, just like our small businesses, also run into resource problems. And so that's why I'm fascinated by your less is more approach. I'd love to hear your perspectives on that, the similarities resource-wise, focus-wise, strategy-wise between big businesses, middle businesses, and small businesses. Because it's easy to trick ourselves into thinking we are unique, nobody else can understand our growth, we are the only company like ours on the planet, but you've had so much experience. Talk about some of those concepts.
Absolutely. In my experience, figuring out how to grow is usually we're not, if we're having trouble growing, it's not because we've got a lack of ideas. Usually, we're flush with ideas. Every once in a while, we need new ideas and we can absolutely go through and brainstorm for those. But more often than not, regardless of the size of the business, we've got a lot of ideas. The number of people that we have to help us accomplish those ideas and the budgets we have are different. But anytime you're scaling number of people, you're scaling number of ideas too. And so really, any size business I've walked into, the same types of themes come up, which is it's really often really familiar to see people doing lots of different things, trying to do lots of different activities. It reminds me of last fall, I was in Branson, Missouri with my in-laws seeing some shows. They love to see shows. And we were at a variety show and there was this, singing and dancing, comedians, and a guy comes up and he's going to do the spinning plates. So, how many plates can he keep spinning on different sticks on the front? And, and he starts with about 3. He's got an assistant. Before you know it, she hands him another plate, another plate, another plate. And there's, now there's 10 plates spinning and some are slowing down. They're about to fall off. He's running all over the stage. There's a lot of activity. People are shouting from the audience, trying to help him figure out, number 1's going to fall, number 4 is going to fall. He's running all around. There's a lot of activity, a lot of chaos. And, ultimately he's trying to keep all those plates moving. Well, what if he only had 3, if he's keeping 3 plates moving, he's able to step back and look at them. He can look ahead. He can see which one's starting to slow down. He can give it the attention it needs right away so it doesn't go off course. Certainly it would be less exciting for the audience, a lot less drama. But, if his goal is to keep the plates spinning, he's going to be a lot more successful if he does, look at fewer. And I think that's often what happens in our businesses, regardless of the size.
Yeah, it's funny. Initially, I knew that we would start talking about your corporate days in a Fortune 500 company, and then I was like, I'm sure there's going to be a natural segue into what you do now, obviously with Crow and Pitcher. But to me, it's funny to hear your answers to all these, because I'm just like, whether we talk about your business, whether we talk about your career, it's so clear how much your brain just looks towards growth and looks towards the strategic questions, so that it really is all one and the same, which obviously has been such a natural transition for you. So I do want to talk about Crow and Pitcher. First things first, before we get into my more strategic questions, Melissa, where does the name come from?
Absolutely. I get this question a lot, and I absolutely love telling this story. When I set out to have my own business, I wanted to have a name that had a story behind it, had some meaning. And, of course, I did a lot of searching and a lot of reading. And when I came across Aesop's Fables, of which Tortoise and the Hare is the most famous, but there's 12, and I started reading about the story of the crow and the pitcher. So it's a story of a thirsty crow in the desert who comes upon a tall pitcher that has a little bit of water in the bottom of it. But his beak is too short, and he can't get the water. He can't quench his thirst, but he's a smart problem solver and has a creative mind. And he looks around and he sees these pebbles, and he realizes that he can put the pebbles in the pitcher and the water level will rise. And then he's able to quench his thirst. And that was pretty intriguing to me. And so I kept reading about it. And I found that there was a team of researchers in New Zealand that actually did this study. And they proved it to be true. Crows can actually complete this task. They're disciplined and creative problem solvers, and they can figure out how to put the pebbles in the pitcher and make the water level rise and quench their thirst. And I was sold at that point and knew that I had to name my company Crow and Pitcher.
Yeah, I love that story. And as someone who loves short stories, you said that Aesop has 12 of those fables. Now I'm just like, dang, you're right. We have all heard of the tortoise and the hare, but it sounds like I've got some reading to do this weekend. So I'm glad that you shared that with us. Melissa, I always like to ask guests, tell us kind of what your company does. But in your case, obviously, I've crawled all through your work. I've gone through your business website, and I see how many different types of businesses that you work with. And that's why for me, more than an elevator pitch, I almost just want to ask you, like, brag a little bit with our listener base. What are some projects? What are some clients that you've worked with? Because I feel like that will illustrate the work that you do in an even more meaningful way.
Well, thank you so much. I love to do this work that, as we've been talking about, helps companies, grow by getting focused. And so actually the first project that I have, and the project that kind of set me off on my course, was with a nonprofit that I work with here locally. I was on their board, and it was time to do some strategic planning. And, what was interesting about that opportunity was that the team I was working with never had the opportunity to kind of step back and think, broadly about their business. Their resources are really strapped. And so I was walking into a situation where, I'm used to doing this big business enterprise level Fortune 500 strategic planning work. And I'm going to be working with a team that has never done strategic planning before. So the very first thing in my business was take the principles of what I did in my corporate job and figure out how to do the same type of principles, get the same types of results, but in a way that people who weren't familiar with this kind of bigger picture strategic thinking could actually handle and do. So that was a really fun project to, kind of get my chops going and figure out how to take these big business skills and apply them with companies of all sizes. I've also had the opportunity to, in my corporate days, I worked on Kleenex and You Buy Kotex. I've worked with a top 10 pharmaceutical company to do some brand positioning work, which is a natural fallout of getting focused on what matters. And also worked with Shopco Optical, which is a regional retail optical business here locally to me, to do some growth drivers work, which was really exciting to help them focus on the pieces of their business that were really driving their business the most, and be confident to let go of some of the factors that they'd been working on, but we learned through a data-driven analysis weren't as big of drivers as they had hypothesized.
Yeah, Melissa, you've already said the word growth and the word strategic thinking so many times in this interview, which I think is an appropriate illustration for where, of course, I wanted this conversation to go. And I love also the plate analogy, the spinning plates that you gave us, because in my head, every time you say strategic thinking, I'm just picturing all of the entrepreneurs and business owners out there spinning plates, looking at you being like, strategic thinking? I'm just trying to keep these plates up. What's your answer there? Where does strategic thinking come in? How the heck are we supposed to think strategically when we're business owners? We're putting out fires. We're keeping the plates spinning.
You're 100% right. And that's why it can be so powerful to bring in somebody who isn't having to focus on that, every day, keeping every single one of those plates in the air. And so that's one of the things that I see when I work with my clients, is that having that fresh perspective of somebody who naturally can see and help them cut through the clutter, can be so impactful right away. So, the way that I like to think about that is, using some simple processes you got to cut out a little bit of time. You got to find a little bit of time to do a little bit of strategic thinking, or bring in a partner. But I like to use what I call the SPARK method. It's a process where we do some work to both do divergent thinking and convergent thinking. It's important to do both. And when we're keeping all those, plates spinning in the air, it can be hard to do that. But with a partner, or if you carve out a little bit of time, it doesn't take too long. And so really what we do is kind of study the landscape. You got to know where you're at. If you don't know where you're at, it's hard to figure out where to go. But then really, after studying the landscape, we prospect for insights. We look at that landscape and say, gosh, what are my top insights and top issues I'm dealing with, or top opportunities I'm leaving on the table? Taking that kind of objective view to get that clear is so helpful. But then we add some creative thinking, like it's okay to brainstorm. It's okay to diverge. You just can't stop there. If you stop there, that's how you add up with more and more and more plates. The really critical step is redirecting our thinking, narrowing that back down, and selecting the top 1 or 2 or 3 things to work on right now, and being comfortable setting the rest of them aside. What would it look like to take 2 of those plates and just put them on the ground? Maybe don't let them fall and crash to the ground, but put them on the ground, knowing that in a few weeks or a few months, you can pick them back up later. We're not saying that the ideas are bad necessarily, but maybe they're not good for right now. And how do we take a couple of those plates and put them down? And so using some data-driven insights allows us to do that. That opens up the last step, which is allowing us to keep that execution consistent. If you can narrow in and figure out which plates are those most important ones, then you can just focus on them. And so that's what I like to do, but it takes a little bit of time to look at your business and be able to think objectively about what's truly going to make the biggest difference right now. And that usually comes from being clear on, how important, how impactful each of those activities are, and how many resources they're really costing you.
Yeah, Melissa, so much in that answer that I'm excited to unpack. But first things first, the thing that I really enjoy that you called out is, hey, the first step is to take that time to think, that time to be intentional. You have to step back. That guy in the middle of the show, as he's keeping the plates spinning, he's going to have to think long and hard after the show to say, gosh, how many plates should I even have in there in the first place? So obviously, I love that analogy. You mentioned divergent and convergent thinking in there. And obviously you think differently about business because of your experiences, because of the perspectives that you have. So I'd love for you, because a lot of business owners probably don't do as intentional of thinking as you do for your clients. What are some of those thought threads, whether they're divergent, convergent? Share more with us about how you think those things through.
Absolutely. And like I said, it's important to do both, right? Typically, people lean towards and feel more comfortable in one or the other. I was talking with a colleague, another solopreneur the other day, and she said, oh, it's, that step to think bigger, to brainstorm and be creative. She's like, I never do that part, and so if that's something that you don't normally do, just let yourself be okay doing that. Give yourself permission to kind of either look critically at your business and make choices to say no or not now. Or on the flip side, do a little brainstorming. Give yourself an hour to think broadly and to not say no, knowing that it's really important to come back around later and say no. I did this with a project team once where they had so many different ideas. Everybody had ideas and they were executing a lot of them. One of the simple things we did was list every single idea, every single thing that was going on. And then we gave each item a score in how effective it was at achieving our goal. So we've got to be clear on our goals, but really looking at each item individually, how effective is it? And then giving each one another score at how many resources is it costing us? And then you can kind of plot those on a 2x2 and see, how many do you have that are low effectiveness but high resource load? Or even more, how many do you have that are low resource load but low effectiveness? They're really easy to say yes to when the resource load isn't very high, but they really add up. And so that's a quick exercise that I've found useful that can, make it a little more clear what you've all got on your plate and how many things to choose from.
Yeah, I love the example of giving yourself a score. An objective score is the important part, which obviously one of my favorite quotes is, you can't read the label from inside the jar. And Melissa, that's why it's fun to hear your perspective here in this interview today, because there are so many things. Like, what do I score myself on? And that's something that you personally are tasked with when you walk into a company, whether it's a nonprofit, whether it's a for-profit company. You have to ask yourself, how do we make this grow? And that's why right on your website, I love that you've identified 3 core pillars that you obviously look at inside of businesses: growth strategies, revenue drivers, and brand positioning. I want to hear your perspective on why are those 3 specific areas that you chose to call out first and foremost at the very front of what your company does. How important are those, and what are the different things you look for inside each of those realms?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So when it comes to growth strategies, this is the part where we're getting clear on which of our options are we choosing. So it's really important in that step to go through that process I was talking about a minute ago, of the SPARK process, where you get clear on the landscape, you identify your issues and opportunities. And that often opens up, going through that process of getting clear on those issues and opportunities and making choices about which ones you're going to go after now. Again, not forever, but now. That often either needs a little more data analysis to help it go through easily, or it opens up some ideas. And that's where the other 2 pieces, come into play. So revenue drivers is a piece that I've found useful sometimes when you're in the middle of strategic planning and you're trying to make those decisions of, how am I going to narrow down and know which of my issues to tackle first, or which of my opportunities I can go after to drive growth. Sometimes you're making assumptions and you're guessing about what's truly driving your business. And so taking an opportunity to look at the data available to you, gather some new data. With a client recently, we used both existing data they had in-house that they hadn't been looking at, they hadn't had the time to dig into, and we gathered some new data for a hypothesis that they had, and they were right. The new data was very impactful to their business. But by taking a data-driven approach to understand what was truly driving their business, that actually, funneled back into that growth strategy process and helped us make those choices. So the more you can use data to help you make those choices of which growth strategy to choose and where to put your money, where to put your people, where to put your time, the more confident you can be. And then lastly, with brand positioning, with my background in marketing, I love to think about brand positioning and consumers and how to connect with consumers. And one of the things that I find is a really common outcome of doing that growth strategy work and that revenue driver analysis work is we often have brand perception issues or opportunities. We might be perceived as one thing, but we want to be perceived as something else. Or we know that in order to grow with a consumer, we need to have a more clear brand position. And so that's work that naturally flows out of the growth strategy and revenue drivers work quite often. But in every single one of those instances, what we're doing is getting clear on where we should really focus in our business, whether that's, different tactics to execute, different priorities to go after or different positioning choices that we can make. And the more that we can make those choices and do less, when you make choices on which tactics to do, you inherently can choose to do fewer of them. That's what I find is often an unlock to, growing more.
Yeah, that answer is pure gold. All of you listeners, go back and re-listen to what Melissa just shared with you there, because every single one of those components is essential to what you said already, which is growing by doing less. And particularly when you talk about revenue drivers, it's a little trick that I learned probably in my early 20s with my own to-do list. Is so frequently we as entrepreneurs, we make these huge to-do lists, and it always gets to a point in the week where I realize there's no way I'm going to get to all these things. How can I eliminate some of these? And the question I always ask myself is, which of these actually makes me money versus just keeps me busy? So I absolutely love your take on that, which I think leads perfectly into something that I'm really excited to talk about, because I'm excited to explore it for myself, which is your free guide, Grow More by Doing Less, 5 Ways to Adopt a Less is More approach. Melissa, talk to us about this guide, because I think so much of what you talked about today sounds like all of us business owners are going to listen to and be like, well, yeah, okay, I get it, to think more strategically. But Melissa, what you bring to the table is asking the right questions, is having that outside perspective. So talk to us about this guide.
Absolutely. And you know what? I'm not immune to those situations either, right? They happen to me too. And I often find myself in those moments where I've got to use my own tools to figure out how to focus and where to spend my time and energy. So what is in this guide is 5 scenarios that I've run across both in my business and in experiences with my clients that are pretty common. And there's signals that you've got an opportunity where you could grow more by doing less. And so what the guide will walk you through is describe that scenario and then give you some questions to ask yourself, as well as some recommended steps that you can take to take action and really cut out that clutter in your own business. So 5 different scenarios that I think are quite applicable across a broad range of businesses, because they come from my background and my clients, which, as we've talked about, are across a pretty broad range as well.
Yeah, and if you're listening to this and you're on the go and you're thinking, well, how many of these scenarios? Maybe you don't have your first client yet, or maybe you're chasing that all elusive 10K a month that so many solopreneurs are chasing, or maybe you've hit a rut in your revenue growth and you're thinking, gosh, what do I do from here? These scenarios apply to every single one of us. Like literally every single one of us is guilty. I'll spill the beans. One of the scenarios that Melissa has in there is you have this lingering question, are all of these marketing tactics really necessary? How many of us have run into that? Literally every single business owner asks themselves that question at one point or another. So Melissa, I love that in your guide, you have a key question to ask yourself and your team for each of these scenarios. That right there starts you thinking in a more productive, strategic way, which I think is such a common thread in all of the answers that you shared with us here today. So I don't do this in every guest episode, but as we come towards the end of this interview, I want to ask you the broad question to really tap into so many years of experience in so many different, not only businesses, but types of businesses, sizes of businesses. Melissa, I want to ask you the broad question of, what's your best advice for all those entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs who are listening to us right now? What should they do? I was going to say, what should they do? But maybe what should they think about? What should they ask? However you want to answer it. What is the action that they should take away from hearing you talk here today when it comes to their own growth plan or growth trajectory?
Well, I am going to lean back on my favorite quote, which comes from Albert Einstein, and it is, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. It's really easy to come up with ideas, but if you spend that time getting clear on the problem or the opportunity or whatever it is, whatever goal you've got in front of you, then the ideas that come to you will be more focused on actually getting that problem solved rather than, and that's really what helps me cut through that clutter.
Heck yeah. Gosh, as someone who loves quotes, Melissa, I love that that's the way that you took that. Sometimes I joke with people that I must have been like an ancient philosopher because I'm happiest just sitting in a coffee shop thinking. And Melissa, I think the same might be true for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But you know what? I think that thinking can then lead you to more focused action, which again is how you can do less, but still grow more.
Heck yeah, I love it. That's such a fitting way to close our conversation. But before we do just that, I want to open the stage for you to tell listeners where the heck they can follow the awesome work that you're doing. And of course, listeners are probably saying, Brian, where the heck do we get our hands on that less is more guide? I want to see those 5 scenarios. So Melissa, take it away.
Absolutely. Well, the 2 best places to find me are my company's website, which is exactly where you can pick up that gift, and the 5 ways to adopt a less is more approach. You can get that at crowandpitcherllc.com/grow. You'll also find other tools and resources and templates available to you out there as well. And then, of course, I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. So please find me on LinkedIn, send me a note, let me know you heard our chat today.
Heck yeah. So listeners, you heard it directly from Melissa. Of course, we are putting these links wherever it is that you're tuning into this show today. We're putting the links in the show description. So definitely check out crowandpitcherllc.com/grow to get your hands on Melissa's 5 ways to adopt a less is more approach to accelerate growth guide. You definitely want to check that out. And also, we're going to put a link to Melissa's LinkedIn page because that's actually how we found Melissa for today's interview. Is she puts out so much awesome content there. Even if you read her description of what she does, you'll see how strategic she is in the way that she shows up, how clear it is on who that she helps. So Melissa, I love the work that you're doing. I hope everybody goes and checks out crowandpitcherllc.com. But Melissa, thanks so much for joining us on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Brian. It's been wonderful chatting with you today.